I've spent a meaningful amount of money over the years on things marketed as health improvements, supplements in quantities I couldn't justify, devices that track things I wasn't sure I needed tracked, gym memberships during periods when the gym remained a compelling theory rather than an actual practice. The return on most of it was modest at best, negligible at worst. The 15 habits in this video cost nothing, not in the marketing sense of free if you subscribe, not free with equipment implied. Actually free, requiring nothing but the decision to start doing them and the willingness to keep doing them long enough for the results to show up. I found most of them later than I wish I had, which is partly what motivates this particular list. 15 habits. None of them require a credit card. The first 3 habits all happen before the day really starts, in the window between waking up and beginning whatever comes next. That window turns out to matter more than I'd been treating it as mattering, and the habits I eventually built inside it cost exactly what I said they'd cost. They also share a structural similarity that I didn't notice until I had all 3 running simultaneously. Each of them is about protecting the first moments of the day from inputs that haven't been invited. Healthy habit 1. Not checking my phone for the first meaningful stretch of the morning, not a rigid, timer-enforced rule, just a practice of letting my own mind run for a while before handing it over to whatever the phone decided was important. The specific time doesn't matter much. What matters is the sequence, my thoughts first, the world's input second. I practiced this backward for years, and then reversed it, and the subjective experience of mornings changed considerably more than I expected from something that cost only a willingness to leave a device on a kitchen counter. The version of this I ran for most of my adult life was phone first, before I was fully awake. A reflex so automatic I often didn't register. I was doing it until I was already 15 minutes into something that had nothing to do with anything I'd decided mattered that day. Reversing that sequence didn't require willpower after the first week or so. The phone in another room is its own enforcement. You don't override a habit that isn't convenient to override. Imagine starting tomorrow that way. The alarm goes off, you get up, the phone stays where it is. For the first 10 or 15 minutes, the content of your thinking is entirely your own, unedited by anyone else's crisis or anyone else's news cycle, or the specific category of manufactured urgency that a notification produces at the exact moment before you've decided what kind of day you want to have. That's not a small thing. In my experience, it's one of the larger things. Healthy habit 2. Deliberate exposure to morning light, specifically outdoor light, within a reasonable period of waking. Not sunbathing, not an elaborate ritual, just walking outside or standing near a window that admits actual sunlight, rather than the indoor lighting most people spend their entire first hour under. The research on this habit has grown considerably over the years I've been practicing it. The short version is that outdoor light in the morning does specific things to the circadian system that indoor light doesn't do nearly as well. I started doing this because someone mentioned it and it cost nothing to try. I've continued doing it because the adjustment to my sleep quality was noticeable enough that stopping feels like a bad trade. 5 to 10 minutes outside in the morning. Not exercising, not doing anything productive, just standing in actual light long enough for the biology to register it. My neighbors have observed this behavior and reached their own conclusions, which I have chosen not to correct. Healthy habit 3. A period of genuine quiet somewhere in the morning, not meditation in any formal sense. No app, no guided voice. Just silence long enough for the mind to settle from the activation of waking into something closer to clarity. I resisted this for a long time because it felt like it required a particular kind of personality or practice I didn't have. What it actually requires is sitting somewhere without an input stream for a few minutes, which is considerably more accessible than the marketing around formal meditation tends to imply. The version I do is not impressive. It's a cup of coffee, a chair, and nothing being asked of me for the duration of the cup. No screens, no task, no productivity, disguised as stillness. Just the particular kind of thinking that happens when the mind isn't being directed anywhere specific, which turns out to be some of the most useful thinking I do in a given day. My family has learned to read the chair and the cup as a combination that doesn't require their input, which is its own kind of progress. The first 3 habits were about protecting the beginning of the day from things that hadn't been invited into it. The next 3 are about how the body moves through the rest of it. They share something with the morning habits. They don't require a separate appointment, a special location, or any equipment beyond the body that's already there. Healthy habit 4. Walking after dinner, specifically after dinner, for 10 to 20 minutes, not as exercise in the gym sense, but as a deliberate wind-down that does specific metabolic things that sitting on a couch after eating does not. The research on post-meal walking has become considerably more compelling over the past several years. The version of the habit I practice requires nothing except the decision to do it and a neighborhood or sidewalk that makes it possible. I started this habit because I'd read something and decided it cost nothing to test. What I discovered was that the walk after dinner became one of the things I looked forward to most reliably in an ordinary day. That surprised me, because I hadn't expected a 10-minute walk around the block to compete with any of the other options available at that hour. It does. Consistently. My wife and I do it together most nights and have had conversations on those walks that wouldn't have happened sitting in front of a screen, which may be the less clinical but equally real benefit. The kids tried to join once, lasted approximately 4 houses, complained about their feet, and returned home, which left us with the walk and the conversation anyway, suggesting that the habit's best feature is its resistance to being diluted by people who didn't choose to be there. Healthy habit 5. Taking stairs, always, without negotiating the exception, as a default physical commitment built into the existing structure of the day, not as a replacement for any other movement, as a baseline tax on wherever I am. The elevator is faster, the stairs are better. Over the course of a day spent in buildings, the difference in effort is modest, and the difference in aggregate movement is real. I want to be honest that this habit sounds more virtuous than it feels in the moment. It rarely feels like anything at all except slightly longer and mildly inconvenient, which is precisely the version of physical activity I've found most sustainable. Dramatic physical effort produces dramatic motivation requirements. Stairs produce nothing except stairs, which is a reliable feature rather than a bug. The principle here applies beyond literal staircases. It's about choosing the slightly harder physical option at every available decision point, the one that requires one more trip instead of combining, the parking spot that's farther, the route that adds 2 blocks of walking. None of these individually are exercise. Collectively, across a day and a week and a year, they add up to a meaningful amount of movement that was otherwise available for free and going unclaimed. Healthy habit 6. Regularly getting up and down from the floor without using hands or furniture for support. This sounds like a party trick until you encounter the research on what sitting rising ability predicts about long-term mobility and longevity, at which point it starts to sound like something worth practicing. The floor is the most available piece of fitness equipment in any home. Using it regularly by sitting on it, stretching on it, getting up from it in different ways, maintains a range of movement that chairs, couches, and the general architecture of American domestic life steadily work to eliminate. Picture a simple test. Sit down on the floor from standing, then get back up, without touching anything with your hands. How many times can you do it, and how does it feel? That test, unremarkable as it looks, is a surprisingly accurate snapshot of the kind of mobility that tends to remain with people who practice it and disappear from people who don't. I had more difficulty with it than I should have the first time I tried it, which was also the last time I needed to be convinced it was worth practicing. The first 6 habits were about the body and when it gets to do what. The next 3 are about the mind. I'll say up front that I was slower to take these seriously than the physical ones, mostly because they sounded like the kind of advice that arrives with too much earnestness attached and not enough evidence. I found the evidence eventually, which is why they're on this list. I also found that the resistance I'd felt toward them had more to do with how they were being presented than with whether they actually worked. That distinction is worth making before dismissing something that sounds slightly too optimistic on its surface. Healthy Habit 7. Deliberate breathing during stressful moments, specifically a slow, controlled exhale that's longer than the inhale. Not a breathing philosophy, not a subscription app, just a pattern that takes about 30 seconds and genuinely interrupts the stress response at a physiological level, rather than at the level of positive thinking about the stress. The mechanism is real, the research is solid, and the cost is nothing except a willingness to remember it exists when the moment arrives. I will not claim that I always remember. I remember more than I used to, which is the honest version of progress available to any habit that requires being recalled under pressure. The first time I actually used it intentionally in a specific heated conversation I prefer not to describe in detail, the effect was real enough that I've used it consistently since. That's the only review a free health habit actually needs. The version I practice is not elaborate. One long exhale, slower than the inhale, then another. The activation of the physiological stress response is automatic and ancient. Its interruption, via the mechanism of slow breathing, is available to anyone who knows it exists, which is most people after reading one sentence about it. The gap between knowing and doing is where this habit either gets built or doesn't. Healthy Habit 8. A defined, bounded window for consuming news and information rather than a permeable, all-day availability to whatever the ambient media environment decides is urgent. I do not abstain from news. I have a period in the day when I read it and periods when I don't. The distinction has reduced a specific category of background anxiety that I'd previously attributed to the state of the world rather than to the method by which I was experiencing it. The state of the world on most mornings is approximately what it was the evening before. The urgency attached to following it in real time is largely manufactured by platforms whose business model benefits from urgency. I read the news once a day in a session that has a beginning and an end. I've discovered that I'm no less informed and considerably less activated than I was during the period when the news was available to me continuously throughout every waking hour. Healthy Habit 9. A specific, concrete gratitude practice, and I want to be precise about the word specific here because it's doing all the work. Vague gratitude, I'm grateful for my family, I'm grateful for my health, is real, but produces diminishing returns quickly. It requires no actual attention to what happened today and therefore becomes a recitation rather than a reflection. The version that does something different asks a different question. What specifically went well today? Not in general, today. What specifically did I do that contributed to it? That second part, the contribution question, is the part most gratitude frameworks omit and the part that produces the most useful thinking. It turns reflection from passive appreciation into active accounting of what working well actually looks like, which is a considerably more useful thing to build a habit around. I do this in a notebook, 3 sentences maximum, the last thing before the light goes out. Not because writing is required, but because writing forces the specificity that thinking alone tends to avoid. The thought can stay vague indefinitely. A sentence has to arrive somewhere, and the somewhere it arrives tells you something true about the day that you wouldn't have known from the thinking alone. The first 9 habits are about what happens during the active hours of the day. These next 3 are about what happens during the recovery hours, specifically the evening and the night, and they share a property I find consistently underappreciated. Improving them improved everything else, including things that hadn't seemed connected. Healthy Habit 10. keeping a consistent wake time, even on weekends, as the anchor for everything the circadian system does. Most advice about sleep focuses on bedtime, which is the wrong end of the problem. Bedtime is largely determined by tiredness, which is largely determined by when you woke up, which is the variable that's actually available to be controlled. A consistent wake time produces a consistent sleep pressure by the end of the day, which produces a consistent bedtime, without requiring you to decide anything about it. I ran the opposite of this habit for most of my adult life, sleeping considerably later on weekends to recover from the week. That's called social jet lag, and it produces the specific kind of Monday grogginess that feels like a character flaw, rather than the predictable consequence of resetting the circadian clock twice a week. Fixing it required only an alarm set to the same time on Saturday and Sunday that sounds on weekdays. That's both a simple solution and one that is moderately unpleasant to implement the first few weeks, at which point the biology adjusts and the weekend alarm stops feeling like a personal offense. Healthy habit 11, finishing eating earlier in the evening than I'd been doing. Not a specific number of hours, not a formal eating window protocol, just the practice of stopping eating with enough time before sleep that the body isn't still processing food when the biology is trying to shift into recovery mode. The overlap between active digestion and the physiology of sleep is not productive for either process, and moving dinner earlier requires no dietary changes, no special foods, just a different clock on the existing routine. I discovered this habit partly by accident during a stretch when family schedules pushed dinner earlier, and noticed the sleep quality improvement clearly enough that I've kept the dinner time even when the scheduling pressure disappeared. My family adapted to this change with the kind of resigned efficiency that families develop when they've figured out that certain habits have become non-negotiable without ever having been officially declared so. The version of the habit that also happens as a consequence. Eating earlier naturally reduces late-night snacking, not because of any restriction, but because there's simply less time for the window to stay open. That secondary effect, which I hadn't anticipated, turned out to be worth as much as the primary one. Healthy habit 12. Keeping the bedroom cool enough to sleep well, which for most people means considerably cooler than the temperature they keep the rest of the house at. The body's core temperature needs to drop to initiate and maintain quality sleep. A warm bedroom works against that process in ways that show up as lighter sleep, more waking, and the general sense of having slept the right number of hours, but the wrong kind of hours. The specific temperature that works varies by person. The general principle does not vary. Cooler is almost always better than warmer for sleep quality. I lowered the bedroom temperature, wore a lighter layer as needed, and noticed the difference within the first week in a way that made the earlier resistance to doing it seem miscalculated in retrospect. This is a free habit in the sense of requiring no purchase, with the asterisk that the electricity costs of a cooler bedroom are real. In my experience, they're considerably smaller than the sleep quality improvement would justify paying for. My wife and I had a brief negotiation about this one that I will describe only as reaching a temperature both of us accepted, with the understanding that both of us were accepting it from different directions. This is the normal state of thermostat negotiations in households, and I have nothing new to contribute to the literature. The first 12 habits were mostly about the relationship between a man and his own body and mind. These last 3 are about the relationships between that man and other people. They operate on a time scale that makes their effects harder to notice in a given week, but more consequential over a given decade than almost anything else on this list. Healthy habit 13. Giving complete attention to the person I'm talking to, which sounds like a description of normal courtesy and is in practice something considerably rarer than it used to be. Not monitoring the phone while someone is talking, not composing the response before the other person has finished, not being physically present and mentally 3 conversations away from the one actually happening. Full presence for the duration as a deliberate practice rather than a default. The research on social connection and longevity is among the most robust in health science. It consistently points to the quality of relationships rather than the quantity of social interaction as the variable that actually predicts outcomes. Full attention is how quality gets built. Half attention is how it gets quietly eroded over time, without either party being able to name exactly when or why things started to feel shallower than they used to. I notice this habit most in conversations with my kids, where the phone on the counter is a different conversational partner than the phone in the pocket. The pocket is a different partner than no phone at all. The quality of what gets said and what gets heard varies in a way that's difficult to describe precisely and impossible to miss once you've paid attention to it for a few weeks. My kids have, on at least 2 separate occasions, directly asked me to put the phone down during a conversation, which I present without commentary as the most useful quality control feedback I've received on this particular habit. Healthy Habit 14. Spending regular time outdoors, specifically outside, rather than inside, with a screen showing outside. The research on time and nature, even modest, even imperfect, even a neighborhood walk that doesn't involve anything that looks like traditional nature, consistently shows effects on stress levels, mood, attention, and markers of physiological stress response. None of it requires a park. A street with trees counts. A backyard counts. The minimum effective dose is considerably lower than the imagery around nature therapy tends to imply. I built this habit in combination with other habits on this list: the morning light exposure, the after-dinner walk, the stairs instead of elevators. The outdoor time accumulates from all of them without requiring a separate dedicated nature session. That's the version of the habit that's actually sustainable for a man with a full schedule, rather than the version that requires a weekend retreat to experience once a year. Healthy Habit 15. Saying the honest, specific, small thing more often rather than the comfortable, vague thing. Not brutal honesty for its own sake, not a practice of announcing every critical thought that passes through your mind. The narrower version, when you notice something true and small and worth saying it instead of editing it down to something that requires less social risk. A compliment said specifically. A concern raised early instead of late. An honest answer given instead of the answer that costs nothing to give. This habit is free in every sense. It's also the one on this list I've found the hardest to build and the most worthwhile to have built. The physical habits are mostly about overcoming inertia. This one requires overcoming something more specific, the preference for smooth surfaces over honest ones. That doesn't respond to the same approach and has to be worked on differently and more persistently than anything else on this list. The compounding effect of this habit, practiced over years, is the most genuinely surprising thing about it. Small, honest moments build a specific kind of trust that becomes the foundation for larger, more difficult conversations when they eventually arrive. Every relationship eventually produces a conversation that requires the infrastructure of trust built by small, honest moments. I've found more than once that this infrastructure existed when I needed it, because of habits built during ordinary weeks when nothing particular was at stake. EOF. Built during ordinary weeks when nothing particular was at stake. That's the real point of 15 habits spread across morning, movement, mind, recovery, and connection. Not the dramatic intervention. The ordinary week practiced better. If you stayed with me through all 15 of these, thank you. I want to say directly that this list took longer to build than it might appear, because most of what fills the health and wellness content space runs in the opposite direction from what's here. It points you toward adding things, buying things, tracking things, supplementing things. What's on this list is almost entirely removal and redirection, which is an unglamorous category of health improvement that doesn't sell products and therefore doesn't get nearly the promotional budget of the kind that does. Subscribe to this channel if that bias toward what actually works matters to you, because there's more of it coming. I also want to be honest about the word unique in this video's title, which is doing more marketing work than I entirely feel comfortable with. The habits on this list are not secret. Most of them are backed by research that's been available for years. What they share is not novelty, but a specific kind of neglect, the neglect of things that can't be sold. That doesn't make them less effective than the things that can, and in several cases makes them considerably more so. While you're here, tell me in the comments which of these 15 surprised you most and which one you're starting with tomorrow. Not this week, not eventually. Tomorrow. Committing to something specific and near-term in a comment is one of the more reliable ways I know to actually start a habit rather than remaining in the intention stage indefinitely. And if you're willing, tell me what free health habit you've been practicing that didn't make this list. I'm fairly confident this list isn't complete, and the habits that didn't occur to me when building it are probably more interesting than the ones that did. Here's the thing about all 15 of these taken together. Not one of them required me to buy anything. Not one of them required a device, a supplement, a subscription, a trainer, a program, or a membership. The health industry, broadly, has a strong financial interest in pointing you toward additions, because additions create transactions, and transactions are the engine. What's on this list is almost entirely the opposite. Things removed from the morning, things removed from the schedule, attention redirected, time reorganized, behavior stopped. The most effective health investments I've made have been subtractions. Stop checking the phone first. Stop eating past a certain time. Stop treating warm as the default for the bedroom. Stop giving half attention to people worth full attention. Stop consuming news in a way that produces anxiety rather than information. Each of these sounds like deprivation from the inside of the habit and almost always produces the opposite experience from the outside of it. That's the pattern I couldn't see until I'd built enough of them to look back at them together. Health, at least the version available without spending money, is much more about what you stop doing than about what you add. The additions have their place. But the subtractions, it turns out, were doing considerably more of the work than I'd credited them with, for considerably less than I'd been spending trying to add my way to better. There's a specific financial parallel worth naming directly. I spent years adding things to my financial life that didn't earn their place, the same way I spent years adding things to my health life that didn't produce the return they implied. The breakthrough in both cases arrived when I reversed the question from what should I add to what should I stop? The answer in both domains turned out to be considerably more available than I'd expected, and considerably less expensive than I'd been spending to find it. That opening image I started with. The supplements I couldn't justify. The devices tracking things I wasn't sure needed tracking. The gym memberships during the periods when the gym was theory rather than practice. I still think about that particular category of spending, not with any great regret, but with the specific curiosity of someone who realizes they were looking for something real in a place it wasn't. The honest version of what I was looking for was the same thing the 15 habits eventually provided. A consistent, low-drama physical existence where the basic systems were running well enough to support everything else I was trying to do. I'd been searching for that in a supplement aisle. It turned out to live somewhere considerably closer to home, requiring considerably less equipment and arriving considerably more quietly than anything I'd paid for had ever managed to announce itself. The 15 habits on this list are not substitutes for everything I was spending on. Some of those things have their place. What they are is the version of health improvement that was available the whole time, free, specific, and producing compounding returns that I was too focused on. Additions to notice were available from subtractions instead. The morning without the phone, the stairs instead of the elevator, the breathing when the conversation gets hard, the bedroom cooler than habit suggested, the walk after dinner that became something I actually look forward to in a way the gym membership never quite managed to be. None of these are photogenic. None of them generate an unboxing video or a before and after photograph. They produce the kind of change that's most visible in the mirror at 50, not in a testimonial at 30, and I've come to believe that's more honest than the other kind. I still spend money on some health things. I have more clarity now about which ones are earning what they cost, because I have a baseline of free, consistent habits to measure everything else against. The supplement has to improve on the baseline. The device has to do something the baseline doesn't do. Most of them don't clear that bar, which is more information than I had before the baseline existed. That baseline test is one of the most useful things I've built, financially and physically. It changed the question from, does this seem like it might help, to does this outperform what I already do for free, which is a considerably harder test and produces considerably better answers. The number of things in the health and wellness category that pass it is smaller than the category implies and larger than nothing. That's the kind of precision that costs nothing to develop and saves a meaningful amount to have. The version of health I'm describing isn't austere. It's a man who goes to bed at a consistent time, wakes at a consistent time, takes the stairs, walks after dinner, drinks coffee in a chair without a screen for 10 minutes, breathes deliberately when something is hard, reads the news once a day and then closes it, says the honest small thing more often than not, and gives his actual attention to the people in the room with him. That's what the 15 habits look like, assembled and running. It doesn't look like much. Over a decade, it looks like something. If any of these 15 are worth starting today, a few things before you go. Follow this channel because there's more of this kind of honest, free, slightly unglamorous content coming, built from what actually worked in an actual life, rather than from what sounded compelling in a video about health that is selling something in the next card over. Share this with someone who's been trying to get healthier but has been looking for the answer in the aisle with prices on it, rather than in the habits that don't require a receipt. Leave a comment telling me which of these 15 you're keeping, and tell me what you want covered next, because that's genuinely how this channel builds itself. One honest, specific, useful video at a time. I'll see you in the next one.